And I'm very glad to be able to introduce Chris Guiterman. His work on these oak shrub fields is fascinating to me, and so I'm actually going to be as enthralled as the rest of you listening to today's webinar. Chris's background is a master's in forestry from the University of Maine, Orono, so it's nice to have a fellow New Englander out here. He came to the tree ring lab at the University of Arizona in 2010 to study dendroechology with Tom Swetnam and Don Falk, and his dissertation explores changes in fire regimes, forest growth, and post-fire recovery in Arizona and New Mexico as influenced by climate variability and land use. So he's also worked on identifying fire-climate relationships in Siberian forests and traced the origins of construction timbers in some of the great houses at Chaco Canyon. And as you can see, I should also mention he's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona, and so we'll look forward to seeing the final dissertation out soon. But today he's going to talk about the persistence and fire regimes of oak shrub fields and how they suggest increasing dominance with climate change. And so with that, Chris, I will give you the floor, and you can take it away. I guess I should note that you can type questions in the chat window in the lower left, and I'll try to handle those if there are any technical issues. Otherwise, we'll save them for the question and answer period at the end. And the last thing I'll say is the webinar is being recorded, so you can share it with your colleagues afterwards. So Chris, the floor is yours, and you can take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Xander, for hosting and for helping me out with this. I hope everybody can hear me. If you can't, please ping Xander on the chat window. I wouldn't really know how to help you. So hopefully you can hear me. I want to thank the folks at the Fire Science Consortium for inviting me, particularly Barb, Pepe, and Xander, and everybody for listening and attending. I really hope that this generates some questions and discussion, which we'll should have time for at the end. So as Xander said, we'll be exploring some of these topics related to oak shrub fields in the Southwest, particularly their persistence and fire regime and how that relates to climate change. And we've been watching the news the last few days. Climate change has been a hot topic. February was the hottest month ever recorded. It broke a record. That was set previously by January 2016, so I think we're in for some more record-breaking temperatures as we go. And with that, in the Southwest regions, we know we've seen warmer temperatures just keep on coming in the last 10, 20 years. This graph from the National Climate Assessment Report, you can see in the top right, the Tmax, so maximum temperatures are going up, as well as Tmin, minimum temperatures, kind of all across the region. Precipitation, interestingly, is not necessarily changing yet, but this is the Southwest. We have droughts. Some are extensive, some are severe, and they play an important role in our ecology here. And what we're seeing is that as temperatures increase and natural variability in precipitation, including drought, happens, we have a combined effect. This is just a couple graphics from a single paper. There's a lot of papers exploring this. But this one was pretty interesting in terms of its use of tree ring data and its regional scale. So what they found was that drought plus high temperatures correlates very, very well to tree mortality, to bark beetles activity, and to high severity fire. And when you take the metrics of climate that are playing into what they call a forest drought stress index, so how stressed forests are in terms of this, and move it forward, we get this really grim picture for what could be happening in the Southwest region. Namely, that bottom graph showing forest drought stress, it goes way down, which means that it's becoming more stressful in the brown highlighted areas, the 1580s megadrought, for which there's good data in the tree ring record that there was widespread forest turnover. It's very hard to find a living tree that's older than 1600, probably because of this drought. And so what we see is that in the next couple of decades, the projected average conditions are going to be right at the level of the 1580s megadrought. So that's a scary thing in terms of tree mortality and high severity fire. There's other things, of course, going on our landscape, namely with fire, and fire history, changes in land use in particular. Since I'm interested in oak, really focusing all of this discussion on fire to the kind of middle elevation dry conifer forests. We tend to call those forests frequent fire forests because we have very good evidence from tree rings and other information that they experience frequent fire. That probably looks like this one pictured here. Just a brief overview of the tree ring record in terms of fire history. The map on the right is a little more, it's probably 15 years old now. So there's a lot more sites, but the yellow dots are fire history sites where 10 to 20 trees would have been collected for their fire scars, like the ones you see at the left. We can look at the growth pattern of the tree rings in those samples and come up to precise annual dates of the rings in which the fire scars are preserved. So you can see exact years of all of these fires embedded within the rings. And from that, we can develop kind of a fire history going back that's well replicated and shows fire activity in that place. So we do this all across the region and come to a composite like this one, which now each of the horizontal lines is the fire history of a particular site. It's filtered for only the most, what we call widespread fires, so the ones that probably covered most of the whole site. The hash marks, the vertical dashed lines, are the individual fires and fire years. So you can see certain periods of time. I'll try to use my pointer here, like that one there, that's 1748. There was fire recorded across almost the entire Southwest in that 1 year. And so this shows the importance of climate in regulating fire regimes, but you also see the variability in fire regimes across the whole landscape. So there's really two things to point out from this, is that these middle elevation dry conifer forests experience a lot of fire until this period. This is the 1900s on to now, where we have widespread fire exclusion across the whole region based on livestock grazing, active fire suppression, mostly those two influences, stopping fire across the whole region. And with that, if we know the story, we go from forests that probably looked a lot like this, very wide open, grassy, park-like, big old trees. You remove fire from a landscape like this, and you have the potential to grow a lot more trees on the landscape that are not being thinned by fire, and it could look like this, the classic Southwest doghair forest. When fire returns to this landscape, it tends to burn at high severity, and this is one of the results: widespread mortality of trees, and a pretty stark look at what was a very different looking forest. So as the story goes, we have fire burning through the surface of ponderosa pine or dry mixed conifer forests. As fuel loads build up, the model changes, and fires tend to spread to the canopy of even the largest trees because of these latter fuels. So what I'm now looking into is one potential consequence of this type of fire behavior, which is an abrupt transition from a conifer forest to something that's completely dominated by oak in northern New Mexico and Arizona. That tends to be Gambel oak. As we come further south in the Sky Island region, there are a bunch of other oak and shrub species that will come in after fire. So along with Ellis Margolis, who I'm collaborating very closely on this project, we've been looking at this at a regional level. There's a number of other studies that are already published documenting the same thing. I won't go into those right now, but what we see is this repeated pattern of high severity fire killing off the canopies of conifer forests, particularly ponderosa pine, and stand now dominated by oak all over the place. This particular one in the San Juan Mountains was the Missionary Ridge Fire, and the stand that we're walking through right here was an 800-year-old pinyon juniper stand that was isolated in this high elevation, and now it's completely oak shrub field. Some of these patches are quite large. let's see, my advancing is paused, so let me give it a second.
We're looking at the image of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Is that the one you wanted?
No, I'm trying to move on. Let's see. Oh, maybe I've run out.
Yeah, you got to go on to the next step.
Okay. Sorry, I forgot about the task. Okay. Thank you, Xander. So some of these patches are quite large and can dramatically change the forest use and ecosystem services of that particular area. Going from a conifer forest to an oak shrub field is quite a change. And they raise a number of questions based on these observations. So some of the questions we're interested in is how old are shrub fields that we know of that are existing on the landscape. I think folks that have been around for a while and have traveled a lot in this area probably know of several old, if not more, old-looking shrub fields. So we're curious about their origins. We're curious about their size of them, and we're doing this at a regional level, like I said, across the whole distribution of Gambel oak, mostly using remote sensing. But in this study, I'm focused on the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. By the way, the inset map here shows the distribution of Gambel oak forest based on the Little Forest Atlas. So where are shrub fields? We used a variety of vegetation data from the region and from the Santa Fe National Forest, the USGS, Baez Caldera, and National Park Service to compile this map showing the distribution of Gambel oak shrub fields in the Jemez Mountains. The graph at the bottom left shows the frequency distribution of those patches in terms of their size. We document here 348 patches in all. We surveyed using aerial photography, like Google Earth or ArcGIS, probably all of these, if not very close to all of these, to kind of as another check to see, yeah, that does look like Gambel oak or at least some kind of shrub species. We also visited a number of them on the ground to really see what they look like. And I'll be showing you this in this particular study. We went in and sampled with tree rings using tree ring techniques, a bunch of those patches. So looking at the distribution, we see that they're mostly on the periphery of the range. Why that is not exactly clear. It probably has to do with elevation, although we're using more GIS techniques to get at that question of why they're there and if there's a bias in their distribution or not. But we do know that there's a lot of them. The total area that they occupy in the Jemez Mountains is 11,000 hectares. The largest individual patch is 666 hectares. And there are 22 patches over 100 hectares. So those are the big ones, the ones over 100 hectares. The total area of those 22 big patches is 36% of the total. So they're important. These big patches of Gambel oak are definitely an important component to this landscape. In setting up the field study, we had to be cognizant of recent fire activity in the Jemez Mountains. This map is most dominated by the 2011 Las Conchas fire, which is that big red blob kind of on the east side of the mountain range to your right there. There's another fire more recently, the 2013 Thompson Ridge fire, which burned kind of the western part of the Baez Caldera, roughly in this area that's not included on this map. Interestingly, not a whole lot of fire activity in the areas where we see the largest shrub fields, which is typically on the western side of the mountain range in the Nacimientos and in the northern part. So in looking at this, when we go to hit the ground, we wanted to know what tree rings could tell us about high-severity fire, about type change from conifer forest to oak, and about the persistence of oak once it's established. So our working hypothesis really had to do with these modern observations, recent observations of these type changes from conifers to oak. And so we looked at oak shrub fields as probably the best available evidence for high-severity fires in the historic era. And because there were patches well over 100 hectares, that became a really interesting thing to look at, because as far as we know from other sources of data, there's the patches of high-severity fire were probably not that big across most of the area. And so we were wondering, are they related to high-severity fire? So we wanted to make sure that we could use tree rings to actually reconstruct high-severity fire in these stands. And so in this paper that we recently published in Tree Ring Research, we validated the methodology. We chose a study area within the perimeter of the Buchanan fire, which was a prescribed fire in 1993. It's a very well-documented fire with very well-documented fire behavior because of the unfortunate incident of a firefighter losing his life in this fire when the wind changed on April 22nd, 1993. High winds blew in and created crown fire activity across a large portion of the burn. So the image of the map here on the bottom left is the footprint of one of those crown fire runs, moving from the bottom right to the upper left. And we went in and sampled tree rings using a methodology that was developed by Ellis Margolis and collaborators in upper elevation forests, conifer aspen stands in particular. We wanted to see if it would work in a pine oak forest. And so the methodology includes looking at multiple lines of evidence. So on the photo collage on the right, A is showing resprouts of oak. So there's a fire-killed oak stem in the middle and then a bunch of stems coming off the bottom that sprouted from the root system there. We can sample those and get an inner ring date to see the year in which they sprouted. B shows a fire scar from a tree. So it's a recent fire scar that would suggest that it was that 1993 fire to us. This happens to be on a single stem large oak tree. There were a lot of those in the intact ponderosa pine forest in this area. There were none in the shrub field. They were killed and replaced by these sprouting shrubs. Picture C on the bottom left shows fire-killed conifers still standing in the shrub field. So we were able to extract wood from those and date the death of those trees. And D on the bottom right shows a living ponderosa pine that survived the fire and experienced a lot of crown dieback. So you can see that the kind of flagged shape of that crown, it had been lifted up. It's standing right on the edge of the burn, and the lower part of the crown points away from that burn area. So it's pretty obvious that that tree was hit by this crown fire, but it wasn't enough to kill it. So we cored trees like that to see if there was any anomaly in their growth that would help us date the fire. So we're using multiple lines of evidence here to get at this sample as we kind of cruise the stand and put in these age structure plots for the oak regeneration dates and find those other pieces of evidence wherever we can in those sites. The results of this particular site point very strongly to that 1993 high-severity fire and really give us a nice picture of the history of this stand. So starting from the bottom left, typical fire history plot. Now instead of composite sites, we're looking at individual trees, and the vertical dashes here being fire scars with all the fire years at the bottom. So we can see a lot of fire through this site until 1871 when fire stopped. That's consistent with fire exclusion in the Jemez Mountains based on the arrival of the railroads and sheep and livestock grazing in the area. Fires typically stop in that period. And then as you look up in the graph, you can see a lot of trees kind of starting to come into the stand at that point, so we're getting increased density. And then the different lines of evidence that come in to help us date this 1993 fire with tree rings. We have fire scars that are dated in 1993. We have death dates, so trees that are growing, and we see the last complete ring at 1992. And then all of the oak stems that we sampled, all 20 of them, have a pit date of 1993, so the very first year that they started growing was 1993. So this was very strong evidence that the fire happened in the spring of 1993. In fact, we got a seasonality of one fire scar in the spring. Everything else was before the growing season. The death date, again, stopping in 1992, means that the tree died before it started growing in 1993, which is consistent with an April fire. So tree rings did a really good job here, and we emphasize in this paper the importance of using these multiple lines of evidence, that any one line of evidence raises other questions or doesn't give you a lot of certainty. Fire scars, you know a fire happened, but you don't know its character. Growth changes, there was some crown dieback, but you don't really know that much. And the death dates is really this critical line of evidence saying that trees died in this fire. And then the age structure also points to 1973, but shows that there was a major turnover in the age structure of the stand. So multiple lines of evidence are really quite necessary when you're going to reconstruct high-severity fire. So we took these methods and we went into 5 of the largest shrub fields in the Jemez Mountains. Doing the exact same thing, we tried for as much spatial distribution in our sampling as possible, although these sites were really quite large. If you can see the black bars in each of these photographs represents the scale of 500 meters on the ground, so half a kilometer. So they're pretty big. They range from 75 hectares at the Redondo Creek site, the upper right site, to the largest in the Jemez, the 600 plus hectare Mesa Penapitosa, which is in the top left. A lot of the sampling occurred on the periphery because that's where some of the best evidence was available. As we cruised through these stands and put in age structure plots, we were really targeting the largest, or what we thought would be the oldest oak, and that was really to try to date the origin of these stands. We were looking for high severity fire, but we wanted to know about the history of each individual site and then how that would work all in unison. And so this is the age structure that we came up with. This is based on about a little more than a third of our sample. I should say we sampled 301 trees in this study. So we have quite a lot of data for each of these 5 sites. This age structure plot shows the number of trees with pith dates, so the green are the oak, with pith dates in that year. So it's not binned at all, it's individual years. The down-pointing arrows represent fires at the site, and they had to be replicated on more than one tree. This dark squares, I know this is quite small and difficult to see, but the dark squares are growth changes, and the circles are death dates. So we have all 4 lines of evidence that we collected all on this one plot, which makes it a little noisy, but you can see some interesting trends. One is that oak cohorts tend to relate to fire, which we knew. Oak is a prolific resprouter following fire. There's some examples of old fires with oak cohorts and then more recent ones. Some of the major takeaways from this are that all of these sites are over 100 years old. The dominant cohort at every single site was about 1899. There's one exception, that middle site, SNN, where the dominant cohort is 1895. But this is a surprising result. I did not expect every single oak patch that we sampled to show a pith date, or a dominant cohort date at the same year. There was also little evidence to support high severity type changing fires in 1899 at each of these sites. So why is the dominant age 1899 at every site? Well, if you look, the arrows stop. That is the last fire at every site. So the oak cohorts are really pointing to the last fire. It's also clear that we don't have the same thing going on at every site. Again, that middle one, SNN, shows a fire in 1899, but the dominant cohort, 1895, is unknown why that cohort came in then. I couldn't find a reason for it. There's no fire. There's no, at least that we recorded, there's no frost ring. Frost might initiate an oak sprout. I really just don't know. There is one case where all 4 lines of evidence point towards a high severity fire. It's that second one, RDC, Redondo Creek, where they all line up in 1899. But I don't show it here, but the spatial distribution of those lines of evidence shows a death date on a ponderosa pine next to a fire-scarred oak and I think another fire-scarred conifer too. So it killed one tree, but that doesn't mean that it was a tree-killing fire across a big area. But it obviously sprouted a lot of oak. So what we see here is really evidence for surface fires that are resetting the oak age structure every time they burn and not necessarily killing the oaks. In fact, these older oaks that come in after earlier fires, say in the 1870s or before, had fire scars. Some of them had 2 to 3 fire scars on them, and there were abundant conifer trees within the shrub fields that had multiple fire scars on them. So it really points toward a surface fire regime, although with probably somewhat more intense burning in some areas because the growth changes on trees that we cored were quite dramatic. Some were missing quite a few rings. So there's some intensity of the burning, but it doesn't appear to be the kinds of things that we're seeing in the stands now, or these major tree-killing fires like the pictures I showed earlier. The fire history at the site is interesting too. So this again is a tree-level fire history where the horizontal lines are the lifespan of an individual tree. The colors represent species, so we see green is Gambel oak, red is ponderosa pine with some others in there. The vertical dash marks again are fire scars. The dots at the beginning or end of the line indicate either a pith or a bark year, so a complete sampling of that tree's lifespan. The dash lines mean that the tree does not have an open wound yet, so we say it's not recording fire at that time. Some takeaways for this, again, we have that shutdown of the fire regime around 1900, and then some interesting examples of prescribed fire. This one here in 1989 was widespread through the site. We think that was Forest Service prescribed fire. This one at Cinerito South, SNS, is 1991, and a forest manager at the Cuba Ranger District Station told us about that fire before we went into the site, so we knew about it, and sure enough, we dated it with tree rings. There's this fire here at RDC, Redondo Creek, which was in the Valles Caldera National Preserve. In 2013, that's the Thompson Ridge fire. So we picked that up in the tree ring record as well. It scarred some oaks. It didn't cause mortality in the oak stands very much at all. And there was a small fire that just barely entered the stand at Mesa Penavitosa in 2010. We picked up. So again, takeaways from the fire history at the sites is that shrub fields burn a lot. There is a lot of fire going on here. We have hundreds of fire scars from over 100 trees, fire scar trees that are included in this plot. The pattern qualitatively looks a lot like what we see in the Jemez Mountains, where we have very high frequency fires until about the 1800s, and then it starts to slow down and become more widespread. And by that I mean that early on only several or more trees would be scarred by an individual fire event, whereas later in the 1800s you see this more pulse pattern where more trees are scarred by those same events. So it says that fires are burning across the area more uniformly than they were earlier. One of our hypotheses regarding high-severity fire at these sites was that you'd have to stop the fire regime for some period of time in order to build up enough fuels to then generate a tree-killing fire. And so we were looking for any kind of gap in the fire history. We found one, interestingly, at every single site that dates to about the same period, 1818 to 1842. It's not a very long time frame if we think of the buildup of ladder fuels, and it could be related to the dominance of oak after that when fire did return, but we don't have a lot of evidence to make that statement in any way conclusive. And the reason for that might be that fires kept on burning. We got 2 or 3 more fires in the 1800s before fire exclusion set in that could have burned up the evidence for a tree-killing fire, say in 1842. In that fire-killed trees will rot over a couple of decades, but they'll burn up even faster when fire returns. So the tree ring approach here might have been a little limited in getting the exact origin of these sites. It's just really difficult to say. Some other methodology that looks at changes in vegetation, like a pollen analysis or something, might be warranted in these stands to try to figure out when they actually might have flipped. But it's very possible that they were oak for a really long time. The fire history statistics here really kind of punctuate the point that there is a high-frequency fire regime at each of these sites. The mean fire intervals here range from 8 years to 21. I should note that 21-year fire interval is really because of that. There's a 58-year gap where we had not enough trees recording. So there's a minimum sample depth kind of issue going on there. There's also a slight trend toward longer mean intervals with a little bit increased elevation, which we see typically somewhat longer intervals at higher elevation. And what we really wanted to know was, how does this compare to non-ponderosa sites? If these sites really are burning at high frequency, do they burn at the same kinds of frequency as conifer sites in the Jemez Mountains? And on that regard, we're lucky to work in the Jemez Mountains because there has been a lot of fire scar sampling in this mountain range. It's probably the most densely sampled range in the world in terms of fire history. So it's an interesting place to work for that. We have a lot of data available. This map shows locations of individual trees that have been sampled for fire history, and the fire scars have been cross-dated. There's roughly 1,300 trees in this map, and overall about 60 sampling sites. So we can take all that data and look at this running fire sum, which is effectively fire frequency over time. The black line shows the average fire frequency or 10-year fire sum across all of those 60 sites for the Jemez, and the gray is the 95% confidence interval around that mean. Each of the shrub field sites then has its own line with different colors indicating the different sites. And you can see that in general, these sites stay within the 95% confidence interval of the whole Jemez. The only time they really get out of it is when they go higher, when sites like SNS, Henry to the south, burn at a higher rate than what the Jemez Mountains normally experiences at that time. It was an interesting 20-year period there in the early 1800s when SNS was burning every few years. I'm not really sure why. It might be related to some grazing or something in that area where shepherds were actually putting fire on the landscape. That site is not far from Cuba and New Mexico. So we really don't know, but it's an interesting trend there. And then you can see the gap in the fires across all sites where in the early part of the 1800s they all go to zero. So shrub fields are burning at the same rate as conifer sites, typically. We also looked at the fire-climate relationship between the shrub field sites and the Jemez sites. So here now, there's a little bit of filtering going on, so we have 36 of those Jemez sites adding to this analysis. This is superposed epoch analysis, which is effectively compositing the climate data for fire years at each site. And the climate data in this case is Palmer Drought Severity Index reconstructed from tree rings, so PDSI. And what we see are year 0 is the fire year, and then the lag years off of that. So -1 through 4 are the preceding years before the fire, and then 1 and 2 are the years following the fire. The triangles show the pattern for the individual shrub field sites. And what we see is typical. This is pretty consistent with regional level kind of fire-climate relationships. We have drought in the year of fire, preceded by a couple of years of wetter than average conditions. There's no assessment of significance for these individual years in this plot. It's really just looking at the overall pattern. Those antecedent wet years are important for fuel buildup, and typically that's grass. We get a couple wet years, you get a good surface fuel of grass and also a good catch of pine needles, and then it cures in that drought year and the site is primed for fire. And then there's so much lightning ignition, in some cases human ignition on the landscape, that fire will happen. The shrub fields are showing pretty much the same pattern, which is interesting because we thought that being shrub fields, they would have this dense woody fuel that would be ready to burn anytime it's dry, and so those antecedent wet conditions wouldn't really matter. That's what we see more today. Because when we talk to fire managers, and hopefully somebody can add to this or correct me if I'm wrong, those of you who are managers out there, that view shrub fields as effective fire breaks because of this dense green fuel structure. This is early spring before growth has really started, even in the mature oak or in the conifers around the stands, but it's already greened up with these kind of understory shrubs. So we found the results, and maybe managers find the results of the amount of fire in these shrub fields to be quite surprising, because the fuel loads in these oak stands are different. You know, it's that dense live fuel. It's leafed up on the surface as opposed to pine needles and grass. So why would we need these antecedent wet conditions that point more toward a grassy kind of environment? And I use this historic photo from 1944 to kind of illustrate what I think these shrub fields might have looked like going back in the historic era. They might have been a little bit more open in a sense. The shrubs were shorter in stature because there's so much fire. You know, every 10 to 20 years they're burning. The shrub clumps might have been more spaced out, allowing more grasses to burn, or grasses to exist in the inner matrix that would carry surface fire. And this makes sense in the sense that you know, we had these observations of oak being scarred by fire and not always killed by fire. So that tends to point toward a very low intensity, probably fast-moving surface fire. This is also going back, you know, the 1800s is before widespread grazing, widespread logging, and fire exclusion. And I think each of those three things has helped promote oak on the landscape. So it's not unlikely that we have more oak out there now than we did, say, 100 plus years ago. So the dynamics changing in these older shrub fields have a different fuel structure and loading than they probably did previously. So to kind of start to wrap up this, we can see that based on our analysis, large Gambel oak shrub fields can persist for more than a century, which lends support to those of us who look at these recent conversions of conifers to oak, as those oak stands are going to be there for quite a while. In looking through aerial photography and in our own field visits, we found a general lack of conifer recruitment or encroachment at any site. So we would think that in the course of a century, especially given the various climate episodes over the last 100 years, like the 19-teens and 1970s, when we had widespread conifer recruitment across the Southwest, we thought we would see those in these shrub fields, and we really don't. There's very little encroachment of conifers into these stands. There's also multiple cohorts of oak present, you know, with and without fire. So we know that the oak are able to self-sustain and can maintain their dominance in the landscape by mechanisms that I'll talk about. But just to illustrate kind of what I'm talking about with this 1935 to present, these are two cases of shrub field sites that don't show much encroachment of conifers. The stand edges are quite stable. The bottom example is one of our exceptions to that rule. This area, I'll highlight it. On the eastern side of the shrub field here, goes from scattered conifers to actually quite a large and dense stand. Well, a dense stand of conifers. It's only 11 hectares. It's not huge in terms of this 200 and, it was less than 250 hectare shrub patch. So that stand of conifers is dominated by white fir, and in it are dead oak stems on the ground. And what we noticed in our field work is that it's kind of a flat spot in a very steep slope. It was also quite wet. There's aspen patch in there, that lighter green color kind of tucked into the darker conifers is aspen. Aspen tend to come in kind of alcove areas where it's a little bit more wet. And so we think the white fir were able to get established because of their shade tolerance. They were able to kind of hang in there with the oak, and then the wetness helped get them to grow tall enough to shade out the oaks and eventually kill them. Now, most of them date to about the 1940s, although their establishment was probably a little earlier, maybe closer to that 1899 last fire. And the site hasn't burned since then. So white fir are not very resistant to fire, even surface fire. And so had this site been burning at the same rate that it was burning over the last couple hundred years prior to 1900, I don't think that stand of white fir would have made it. The oak would have held out. So if we have more fire going forward in the future, I think stands like that are not really the hope in terms of getting oak stands back to conifer. So we really don't see a lot of instability in these larger oak stands. It's possible that small ones were grown in and taken over by conifers, but it still would take a long time. And when we think about oak persistence, the topic of climate change becomes very relevant because we know that oak can persist through post-fire resprouting. We've documented that ourselves, and there's abundant information on that already. There's also good data in the literature on the competitive advantages that oak or resprouting shrubs have over particularly young conifers. And then we know that oak in general, Quercus species, are more resilient than conifer species to drought. And there's good data from the folks at NAU, Northern Arizona University, that Gambel oak is more resistant to drought than ponderosa pine. And they've looked at that in a number of different ways. So as climate changes and gets warmer, the conifers are going to suffer a bit more than the oaks, which is going to help the oaks persist. And I think particularly talking about young conifers, we have the potential for the regeneration niche. Those conditions that young ponderosa pine need to establish are going to become less frequent and harder to come by as it gets too warm for the conifers to really regenerate. Resprouting shrubs with an old existing rootstock don't really have that problem. They're there and they can stay there and can keep resprouting and have typically more moisture available to them than the young or younger conifers. So we think with climate change, the amount of forest land dominated by Gambel oak could increase. And that's because of this likelihood of high-severity fire across large areas, especially where oak is already established. And like I said, it's not totally certain, but it appears that oak is probably spread across the landscape because of fire exclusion, logging, grazing, these ground disturbances that might help oak get established in more areas. It resprouts, but it also can seed into places and get established that way. And again, looking at the literature, there's some evidence, good evidence of that happening. So finally, I think what this means in terms of management of the landscape, it really supports restoration of ecosystem processes in frequent fire forests. So if we continue on this trajectory and allow large high-severity fires to burn, I think we can expect more oak shrub fields in those places where it already is. Perhaps in other areas, but certainly where it's well established already. It's just going to come right back, even in the year of fire. So if we can maintain more open, frequently burning stands, I think that will reduce the amount of the landscape that can transition to this oak dominance. There's many people to thank for this. Certainly my collaborators, Ellis Margolis, Tom Sweatman, Don Falk, Craig Allen. We had a lot of help in the lab and in the field. And we were funded by Bandelier, the Western Mountain Initiative, and the USGS. So like I said, I hope to generate some discussion. And Xander passed this photo on to me on this topic. I think it's a pretty good one for this because you can see what at least looks like some oak or some kind of oak species in the understory of a pretty open pine stand that's burning on the surface at low severity to conifers, and will probably stay in that state, whereas a rolling crown fire in a stand like this could have transitioned to something quite different. So thank you all for paying attention and listening, and yeah, there should be some time for questions, I hope.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. That was a great presentation, and I think it's a topic I've wondered about for a long time, and so it's nice to see some actual science going in to answer some of these questions. I guess we all need to learn to love oak.
Maybe.
So if any out there has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat window, and I will sort of read them off. We have 30 people on the line, so I think I won't unmute the phone line, and we'll do it via chat window. And if you don't ask quick questions, then I'm going to have to call out people. Good. So Nick asks, have you or will you study the southern species, gray or Arizona white?
I have not personally. I think there's some others working on those species, but no, I've really kind of had my head dug into the Jemez Mountains and Gambel oak. It's not only oak or Gambel oak that we sampled. There was New Mexico locust and Rocky Mountain, these stands, and their story pretty much lines up with the oak. They tend to resprout along with fire. So they were included in those graphs, although in minority proportions.
Great, thank you. It sounds like we have a lot of information on fire history in ponderosa pine and other conifer stands, and it seems like this is some early work, and like Nick's question heads towards, we would need more studies across more of the Southwest to kind of build up the same kind of overall consensus. So yes, this is what's going on in most places, but it does seem like there's some logic would suggest that it happens in similar sprouting species. Yeah,
absolutely. Some of the work that I know of from friends and colleagues here at the University of Arizona in the Sky Islands shows that it's the same kind of thing. You get high-severity fire in ponderosa or dry conifer forest, and there's shrubs moving in. Although, say, like in the Catalina Mountains outside of Tucson, there's different assemblages of shrubs. They're like more chaparral type species that are coming into some of those stands. And there's a bunch of Madrian oaks, but Gambel oak in particular seems to be kind of isolated more in the higher elevation areas down this way, whereas it's all over the place up there in the Jemez.
Great. Anne has a question about sort of the growth form of oaks, and she highlights that it can take essentially two growth forms, a small statured shrub and a more upright tree form. And in general, in your presentation, you sort of lump both as shrubs, but she points out that they're structurally different. And she's wondering if you saw any differences in fire frequency or severity if you were to sort of separate out the shrub form versus the single-stemmed taller oaks.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks, Ann. In the Jemez Mountains, where we were, I refer to them as shrubs because in these large patches, you don't see a lot of those single stems, although you see large stems, but it's pretty obvious that those are clonal patches with, 5 to 7 ramets or stems off of single clone. So it looks like any kind of young, shrubby, sort of post-fire structure only 100 years later when there's a little bit of self-thinning and the actual stems are much larger. But they still have that appearance of shrub oak, just big. So we didn't really look at stands where there's those nice single stem, kind of trees that can be hundreds of years old that look like they probably originated maybe even from seed, and there's no obvious genet or clump around them. We did, like that, I had that picture early on of the fire-scarred oak from the Peggy Mesa site. There were several large single-stem forms in there, and so not enough data to say if there's a difference in fire frequency or anything between the different kinds of sites and growth forms. I just didn't look at that in that way.
I think, though, that the question does raise an interesting research topic, and that is how have we been lumping in our fire modeling, have we been kind of lumping these things together, and as it's a growing, expanding forest type that maybe we need to deal with more, fire managers, teams will need to address more. Maybe we need more specific research on fire behavior and sort of categorizing it by these life forms. So it's certainly an interesting question.
Yeah, and that may be, Xander, just to echo that with the kind of what I was trying to get at with the sort of management implication of a lot of fire in these shrub fields, and the fact that or at least our hypothesis that the fuel structure might have been different, 100, 150 years ago because of so frequent fire. It tends to point to the probability of reburning in these recent high-severity fire areas that are now dominated by oak. It's probably a lot higher than it would be in these large patches that haven't burned for 100 years.
Great. So Krista asks, or says you found very few old oaks. Is that a lifespan issue? Is it possible that there were significant harvest of big old oaks in the 1800s? And she also asks if you would expect to find stumps, or would they decay, etc.?
That's a great question. Again, because we weren't searching the landscape for those large single stem ones that we typically think of and have sampled before, or at least other people have sampled them, and they're hundreds of years old. No, these patches were largely even aged and even sized. If we had come across an old oak stump, we would have sampled it. I don't remember ever seeing one. So they probably would decay. Oak certainly decays a little faster than the conifers. Not sure if I'm getting all of that question.
Okay, well maybe, Chrissy, you can kind of expand on it a little bit. Anne has another question about acorns and their sensitivity to fire. She points out that it strikes us that in-seeding into patches can really only occur in the absence of fire. Respouting is another matter and probably speaks to fire adaptations and resilience re-fire. So I guess it's getting to the autoecology of oaks in these systems.
Yeah, the literature on this that I've looked at shows sort of the expansion. It's mostly from Utah, where the grasslands meet sort of oak shrub fields, which, oak as a shrub and in these large shrub patches is quite different in Colorado and Utah than it is, and even as far north in New Mexico as the Jemez Mountains. There's much larger patches of shrub oak up there. So there's probably a different dynamic when you cross that border for whatever reason. But data from Utah shows these sort of encroachment of oak into grasslands, the same way we think of conifers or encroaching grasslands without fire. It seems to be lack of fire the last 100 years. You're getting oak encroachment, and they're seeding in. They're not like kind of resprouting off of rootstocks that are extending into the grasslands. As far as oak seeding into places where there's a lot of fire, it must, but it's probably the same dynamic of how ponderosa pine survives in a place where there's a whole lot of fire, and is able to reach mature status. I think you probably just get some trees that find the right spot during the right time and can make it and get up. There's certainly tall oak trees in other places where there's a pine oak type, like in the southeastern United States, and there's a whole lot of fire in those forests even still with prescribed burning efforts down there, and you get big oaks. So I'm not really sure, but there's I think some dynamic there where oak can find a way to get in as large trees from seed.
Great, and we've reached the top of the hour. I think Chris is willing to stay on and maybe answer a few more questions for a few more minutes, but we certainly, if you need to leave, we understand, and we thank all the participants for your time. And please do join us on future webinars, and if you have ideas for future webinars, please send an email. We'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording soon, probably next week. Yeah, for those of you who can stay, it was pointed out that actually there's, although it's listed as Ann Lynch is the person who logged in, there's actually a group of 6 people sitting around peppering Chris with questions. And their third question is, if you don't see these patches carrying high severity, and if your lines of evidence all point to shrub fields carrying and handling low severity fire, frequent fire, how did these patches get established in the first place?
Sure. Before I speculate on that, just wanted to say for anybody who's taken off or sticking around, I neglected to put my email address into this presentation, so I just posted it on the chat there. So my email address is there available, and if you want to email me later on with a question or anything, I'd be happy to respond to those. So getting to Ann's question, how did the patches get established? Well, I don't know. What we try to do, and I didn't emphasize it in my talk earlier, in our sampling, in our discussion and look at these, was find oak patches that we thought were suspicious. They were embedded in ponderosa forests and didn't have something that obviously made them or promoted oak, like a riparian area, a really steep, talus, exposed slope. Places where conifers just generally wouldn't get established, but you can imagine oak might be able to get a foothold and stay. In riparian areas, I don't know, there seems to be a lot of oak in riparian areas. So we try to avoid those areas, and we looked at patches that, from kind of looking at, through your fire lenses would say, yeah, that's weird. That looks like a fire patch. So let's go in there and figure out when that thing burned. And then we, didn't really find evidence from that. So I think it's really likely that these stands got established because of high-severity fire. What I don't think is likely was that high-severity fire was in 1899. What I also don't think is likely is that high-severity fire was, say, 100 hectares or 200 and something hectares or 600 and something hectares to create these patches that we went and sampled. I think there's a more long-term dynamic going on with fire killing trees and establishing oak in pulses and in places. So it's sort of like an expanding gap kind of idea, although it gets to sizes that are much larger than a gap, these big 100-plus hectare patches. The patches that appear to be occurring today in fires like Las Conchas and Dome are in the order of, hundreds to thousands of hectares and blow away what we see from this sort of paleo look at oak patches. So I think it's the same dynamic happening on an entirely different scale because of the changes that have been wrought to these forests over the last 100-plus years and because of climate changes going on now.
Interesting. Nick is looking at a slightly different question, thinking about whether the patches, you have that nice map early on of the shrub fields, and he was wondering whether they align at all in terms of the topography with structures that would support crown fire saddles or chimneys.
Right, that is a great question. So we're looking into that in a statistical way, but I can tell you anecdotally from being in these sites and from flying Google Earth across these sites 100 times, these oak patches span every topographic position available to them. They're in valley bottoms. They go right up the mid-slope. They're probably a little bit tilted toward that upper slope position where you'd expect higher intensity, high severity type fire burning. They also tend to be shorter in stature when you get up into those places, probably because the growing conditions aren't quite as good. And the patches are, the oak stems are much more dense. Say if you're at the top of a ridge and you're descending down into the oak field, that first few hundred meters is like swimming. And then it starts to open up as you get down lower and the trees get taller and you can even walk right under the canopy. But they're all the same age, which is interesting. So I think there could be a slight trend there, but really I think these oak patches are kind of everywhere, and there's something else that might be influencing them, or at least they're able to establish kind of wherever and then hold. And that's kind of the critical finding of this, is that these things will, once they're established, they're going to stick around. And I think they'd be extremely difficult to get rid of. You can't burn them out, and you can't not burn them out. So what other tools are available without super high costs and a lot of management action, I'm not sure of.
Yeah, sort of hard to know where to go there. Let's see. Kit has a question or a comment here. Aside from competition from shade-tolerant trees during fire exclusion, are there other mechanisms that would tend to cause an overall shrinking of an oak patch size? There seems to be a lot of evidence for fire tolerance in the studied patches. And then Kit points out that you sort of just touched on this, and maybe, as you said, without a lot of management, there isn't a lot of evidence. But maybe that's also, I think, one for this group. We've still got 20-plus people on the line. So if there are folks out there who have other insights from specific places where you work, where you've seen evidence of transition or management actions that tend to shrink these patches, I think everyone would be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the patterns are going to shift by region, by where you live. I think in some areas where, maybe that are more productive, conifers will just come right on in. A paper just came out recently from California looking at kind of chaparral patches embedded in mixed conifer forests. And from 1935 to now, the conifers really encroached and reduced the size of those patches quite a lot. but it's a much wetter, more productive system than we have here in the Jemez Mountains, at least. Yeah, one of the famous early papers of this is Savage and Maft, 2005 from the Canadian Journal, and they proposed that fire suppression in these oak stands should help promote conifers. But I think our data kind of show the opposite effect. That, like I said, you can't not burn them out. The conifers are not coming in. Although we wonder where the threshold is. At what patch size, say over the course of 100 years, will conifers be able to take back? It's somewhere below this 100 hectare, 200 hectare threshold. I don't know where it is though.
Interesting. I personally would be interested to see that paper you mentioned from California, and maybe if you pass it along to me, I can include it as a side note in the follow-up email to the rest of the participants.
Sure.
Or a reference to it, I should say. And maybe if there are no other questions, we should let Chris go. I think this is a very interesting topic, and I think Chris or anybody else who has ideas for kind of furthering this conversation, because it seems to me that this is an area where the consortium could really help out. It seems a sort of an emerging topic that maybe we didn't learn about as much in school, or there are new elements that aren't as well documented that could benefit from observations of managers and researchers kind of testing out new ideas. So I think I would encourage folks to get in touch about this. And Nick mentions root disease, and he says, I'm not even going to be able to...
yeah, I'm reading that.
Yeah.
A certain species of root rot bearing corn in oak stands. Could be. Oak certainly rots a lot, and there's turnover in these stands that we know of. So maybe a potential biocontrol.
Well, and I think the other question is, maybe this is the most climate-adapted cover type for some of these areas in a changing climate. Well, wouldn't advocate for trying to encourage oak shrub fields. I think one of the questions that we as a community have to face is, are they bad? Are they good? Clearly, it's partly our sort of societal preferences that make them one or the other. And so some study of the ecosystem services that they provide or don't provide, I think will be an important addition.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and certainly people are looking at that in terms of these high-severity fires that are happening, and across the region. And I think in places where the oak is established, that the soils are more stable because the oak come right back, and you're not left with kind of the moonscape that was left in huge areas of, say, Las Conchas fire. The oak come back and take it, and so those ecosystem services may change, but I think a lot of the important ones like soil fertility and water may be more stable.
And Krista points out that in terms of learning to love oaks, maybe we can learn to love them because there may be less sublimation in these patches than adjacent conifer stands. So I think that's probably need further study, but it's worth looking at.
They're not evergreen in all areas, so you're seeing ground in the winter.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Chris, and please do, if other folks on the line have other suggestions or comments, feel free to email in and we'll sort of follow up. I think this will be a continuing topic for us. So thanks for getting us started, Chris, and we appreciate the effort you put into the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks again for having me, and yeah, I appreciate everybody staying on the line here, and please do email me if you have any other questions hit you later on in the day or whenever. I'm certainly interested to hear more perspectives as we go forward with the study.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.